Hello there. Good evening. I'm exuberantly bored and just had me tea at the lodge at Cygnet Q Stakes Western Supermare Rehabilitation Unit. We had chicken tikka. Very nice it was too. Yesterday and this morning, chatting to a friend, I put in loads of prompts into Gemini all about economic history and the unionisation of Europe and also fiat currency and fractional reserve banking. And it kind of led me on a thread where we first discussed the Lisbon Treaty to start with. I was trying to get some information, do some research on that because it was quite controversial in some ways. I'm not, to be clear, a pro or anti Remain EU voter. I didn't vote in the EU referendum and I kind of impartially appreciate my ignorance with respect to that. Having said that, I did ask some questions that were kind of skewed from a bit of a conspiratorial point of view. And I think that kind of reference is quite important because there are some kind of idiosyncratic sovereignty erosions and also lacks or kind of degradation of domestic infrastructures which have happened since the neoliberalist kind of unionised system of economics that we have now started after the Second World War. And anyway, I won't bang on about it. I'll just read you what it says. That's what I do in these videos. Shit, isn't it? But if you get the chance to watch the whole thing, you might find it interesting, maybe. Who knows? So I asked, how would you broadly summarise and define... Oh, that's the end of the thread. Let's go right to the top. It's going to take ages to make this video. Might even be like an hour long. But I don't care. Neither do you, probably. So, I asked what was controversial about the Lisbon Treaty during the formulation of the EU and how does it correlate with conspiracy theories about the Fourth Reich and an economic debt slavery via profligation of fiat currency and central banks and the IMF. Gemini said, here's a breakdown of the controversies surrounding the Lisbon Treaty and how its provisions are sometimes correlated with the theories that you mentioned. It's important to note the Lisbon Treaty is a complex legal document that amends existing EU treaties. The correlations described are interpretations made by critics and proponents of specific theories. They're not an official or universally accepted analysis of the treaty's purpose. So the key controversies of the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty was signed in 2007 and entered into force in 2009 and was highly controversial. The main criticism centred around its perceived impact on national sovereignty and democracy. Similarly to the EU constitution, the treaty was seen by many as a repackaged version of the treaty establishing the Constitution of Europe. This proposed constitution had been rejected by voters in French and Dutch referendums in 2005. Critics argued that repackaging the core ideas into an amending treaty was a deliberate tactic to bypass the need for popular referendums in most member states. So there you have what I talked about a minute ago, what it describes as a loss of national sovereignty. This was the central fear. The treaty expanded the use of qualified majority voting, QMV, into dozens of new policy areas that previously required a unanimous vote. So that meant individual nations lost their veto power in these areas and could be outvoted by a majority of other states. Creation of a superstate. The treaty created new powerful roles such as long-term president of the European Council and also a guy who was the high representative or a lady, I'm not sure, for foreign affairs and security policy. Critics saw this as the creation of an EU president and foreign minister, further centralising power and creating the infrastructure of a single European superstate. So there was a democratic deficit. Many argued the treaty further distanced the EU decision-making from ordinary citizens. They felt that power was being transferred from directly elected national parliaments like the UK Parliament or the French Assembly Nationale to the less understood and, in their view, less accountable institutions of the EU in Brussels. The Irish referendums. Ireland was the only country to hold a referendum as required by its constitution. And initially they rejected it. So 2008 they voted against it. This sparked a crisis and after receiving several guarantees, For example, on neutrality and taxation, Ireland held a second referendum a year later in 2009, which then passed. Not very democratic in a way. Critics pointed to this as the EU forcing a member state to vote again until it gets the right answer. Correlation with the Fourth Reich theories. Just to be clear, like, I've read a lot of stuff about kind of there being economic progression of predatory and sort of delegitimizing nature after the Second World War. I don't believe that necessarily there was a Fourth Reich or that it inculcated any sort of economic union, but there is conspiracy theorists on the internet who do. So this theory posits that the EU is a modern day non-military attempt to establish a German-dominated European empire or a Fourth Reich. So the claimed correlation, proponents of this theory do not see the EU as a partnership of equals, but as a vehicle for German power. They argue that centralisation as a tool, the Lisbon Treaty, by significantly strengthening the central EU institutions and weakening the national veto via that QMV method, is seen as the perfect tool for the EU's most powerful member, which is Germany, to impose its will on others. Economic dominance. Germany has the largest economy and is the main surplus country in the Eurozone. So theorists would argue that Germany uses this economic power to control the EU's political agenda, and that results in a loss of sovereignty. The treaty's removal of national vetoes is interpreted as the final step in subordinating other nations' foreign and domestic policies to a central body that, in their view, is ultimately controlled by German interests. So, correlation with economic monetary theories. This set of theories revolves around the idea that a global elite uses international finance, fiat currency, central banks and debt to control nations. The claimed correlation. These theories view the EU, particularly the Eurozone, as a key regional model for this system. The Lisbon Treaty is seen as a political mechanism that locks countries into this economic system. Central banks and fiat currency. These theories are highly critical of fiat currency like the euro or the US dollar that's not backed by a physical commodity like gold. They believe this allows central banks, in this case the European Central Bank ECB, to create money out of thin air. The Lisbon Treaty, along with the Maastricht Treaty, which codifies power and independence of the European Central Bank, which proponents of these theories see as unaccountable, supranational financial power. So the loss of monetary sovereignty. By joining the euro, nations gave up their own currency and their own central bank. They can no longer devalue their currency to become more competitive or print their own money to manage a crisis. They became dependent on the politics of the European Central Bank. So economic debt slavery and the IMF. The correlation here is best seen in the European debt crisis. For example, Greece, Ireland, Portugal. When these countries faced bankruptcy, they could no longer print their own money to pay their debts. They were forced to seek bailouts from the European Commission, European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These institutions provided loans in exchange for the country implementing strict austerity measures, cutting public spending, raising taxes, selling state assets. So theorists frame that as debt slavery. The supranational banks, European Central Bank and IMF, International Monetary Fund, lend fiat currency to a nation, and when that nation can't pay, the bank seize control of its national budget and economic policy, effectively ending its sovereignty. In this context, the Lisbon Treaty is seen as the political cage that makes this system inescapable. By transferring sovereignty and removing vetoes, it allegedly prevents a country from easily leaving the EU or the euro to escape the demands of its creditors. I then asked, how does this relate or regard to the Treaty of Rome? So you can think of the Treaty of Rome, which was passed in 1957, as the foundation, and the Lisbon Treaty in 2009 as the major structural expansion built upon that foundation. So the Treaty of Rome was started, the entire project, by creating the European Economic Community, EEC. The relationship is one of direct linear progression. So from economic foundation to political union, the Treaty of Rome was on the surface an economic treaty. Its primary goal was to create a common market by establishing the four freedoms: freedom, movement of goods, services, capital and people, originally workers. But the treaty's preamble famously stated its intention to lay the foundations of an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. How this relates, critics and theorists see this as the original sin. They argue that while it was sold to the public as a simple trade bloc, common market, its core DNA was always political union. The Treaty of Rome was created the key institutions, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament and the Courts of Justice, that the Lisbon Treaty would later dramatically empower. So how the theories connect to Rome and Lisbon? From the perspective of the theories you mentioned, or that I mentioned in my prompts, The Treaty of Rome is simply phase one of a kind of long-term plan that was accelerated by the Lisbon Treaty. You can look at that as phase two. So the superstate theory, the Treaty of Rome is seen as the initial gentle step of getting nations to give up sovereignty. By creating the common market, it bound Europe's economies together, especially France and Germany. The Lisbon Treaty is seen as the moment this superstate became a political reality by weakening the national veto via qualified majority voting and creating a central EU leadership, EU president, moves that were only possible because of the economic and legal groundwork laid by Rome and its treaty. So the economic debt slavery theory factors into this narrative. The Treaty of Rome is the direct ancestor of the euro. The common market and the free movement of capital is created logically and led to the idea of a single currency, the euro, and a single central bank, the European Central Bank, to manage it. So Rome created the economic framework. The Maastricht Treaty in 92 created the monetary union, the euro and the European Central Bank. And Lisbon solidified the political power of these institutions, which in this view makes it impossible for nations to escape the debt slavery system of the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So in short, the controversies of the Lisbon Treaty are seen by critics not as new problems, but as the fulfilment of the political integration that was always intended but kept quiet within the economic language of the Treaty of Rome. So I said, then the bank, there's this thing called the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements. I asked, how does that feature in this narrative? In the narratives you've described, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, is often cast as the apex institution, the central bank for central bank that sits above the regional institutions like the European Central Bank and even the IMF. Based in Basel, Switzerland, the Bank of International Settlements is a real institution. Its stated mission is to foster cooperation among the world's central banks like the US Federal Reserve, Bank of England and the ECB, and ensure that global monetary and financial stability is achieved. Here's how proponents of these theories fit the Bank of International Settlements into the narrative of my conspiracy delusion. The apex of financial control system. So in the economic debt slavery theory, the Bank of International Settlements is seen as the top of the financial pyramid, the hierarchy to you just followed. So they are basically a global, unelected and highly secretive body where the world's top central bankers meet privately to coordinate global monetary policy. In the middle layer, the European Central Bank, International Monetary Fund and Federal Reserve, these are seen as the regional managers. The European Central Bank in this view is not a truly independent European entity, but rather the regional branch responsible for implementing the global agenda set by the Bank of International Settlements across the Eurozone. Below that, you've got all the national sovereign governments, or not as the case may be. These are subjects who, having given up their monetary sovereignty by joining the euro and their political sovereignty via treaties like Lisbon, must accept the policies dictated from above. Proponents of this view argue that the BIS is the body that creates the global rules, like the Basel Accords, which are real banking regulations that all member central banks must then enforce, regardless of the democratic will within their nations. So the link to the EU and the euro. This theory relies on key historical facts. The groundwork for the euro was laid at the Bank of International Settlements. So you've got something called the Delors Committee, the group that created the blueprint for European Monetary Union and the euro in 1988. It's the same year my parents got divorced in Reading. And that was chaired by Jacques Delors, but met at the Bank of International Settlements headquarters in Basel. In this narrative, this isn't a coincidence. It's seen as proof that the entire euro project was conceived and planned by this global banking elite at the Bank of International Settlements and then handed down to European politicians to implement. So therefore, you've got the Treaty of Rome creating that ever closer union is seen as the political first step. The Maastricht Treaty in the 90s creating the European Central Bank and euro based on the BIS hosted committee's original plan as the economic trap, and the Lisbon Treaty as the final step that locked the cage by removing national vetoes. So the link to the Fourth Reich theory, this is where the Bank of International Settlements' highly controversial history is used as evidence by conspiracy theorists. So founded to handle German debt, it actually was first started, the Bank of International Settlements, in 1930 with one of its primary original tasks being to handle German reparation payments from the First World War. So its activity during the World War II, the BIS famously remained open and operational throughout the entire Second World War. It has been documented that the bank accepted gold looted by the Nazis from the central banks of occupied countries like Austria and Czechoslovakia and conducted transactions for the Nazis. The narrative's conclusion for these conspiracy theorists this is like very much the smoking gun. They argued that the BIS was the financial institution that survived the fall of the Third Reich and allowed then afterwards the same powerful industrial and financial interests to continue their project and kind of take over the world, sort of, a bit, in a way. In this view, the BIS is the missing link, the financial bridge that connects the old Reich to the new EU superstate, first by laundering its assets and then by hosting the committee that would design its new content-wide currency. Then I've asked for a sort of picture of European nations' national debt since the Second World War. So here's a history of European national debt since the Second World War, broken down into distinct economic eras. So the story of Europe's post-war debt is not one of a straight line, but a rather dramatic U-shape. The long period of decreasing debt followed by sharp and sustained increase that continues today. So post-war burdens 1945 to the 50s. So immediately after the Second World War, European nations were crippled by unprecedented levels of debt. So immense debt loads. The United Kingdom was in the most extreme position. To finance the war, its national debt peaked at over 250% of its gross domestic product. Other nations, victors and vanquished alike, faced similar, if not as high, burdens from war financing and the need for total reconstruction. So debt forgiveness, a crucial event of this period, was the 1953 London Agreement on German external debts. This accord basically just chopped it in half. So this cancelled approximately 50% of West Germany's pre-war and post-war debt and restructured the remaining payments. This forgiveness granted by creditors, including the US, the UK, France as well, was vital for Germany's economic miracle. I don't know how to pronounce that word, but it laid the foundation for its future economic stability too. Between the 50s and 73, there's what they call 30 glorious years. In France, there was a golden age for debt reduction across Western Europe. So debt to GDP ratios fell dramatically, but not primarily through austerity. How debt melted away. The key driver was a high nominal GDP growth, which was a powerful combination of strong real growth and economies rebuilding. Productivity was soaring and trade was expanding. Moderate inflation, a steady moderate level of inflation made old debts, which were fixed in nominal terms, shrink in real value relative to the fast-growing size of the economy. Fiscal low point, but by the 70s, a lot of countries had reached their post-war debt low. So West Germany, debt to GDP was like 30%, France, it was 20%, UK, it was like around 50%, and Italy, it was about 34% of GDP in the 70s anyway. So from the mid-70s to the 1980s, the golden age sort of came to an abrupt end. The 1970s reversed the trend and began the era of rising peacetime debt. So there was oil crises and stagflation. In 73 and 79, oil price shocks ended the post-war boom. They triggered stagflation, which is a kind of nickname for toxic mix of stagnant economic growth and high inflation. The government response was the attempt to fight the recessions using Keynesian policies, effectively increasing public spending and cutting taxes to stimulate demand. For the first time, the spending wasn't matched by high growth, so structural deficits started to emerge with slow growth, high unemployment, which required more welfare spending, and then compounded by expanding social programs like pensions and healthcare. Government spending began to permanently outpace tax revenues, and this created the first large-scale persistent peacetime deficit. So debt begins to climb. This was the beginning of the modern debt problem. Italy saw the most dramatic change. Its debt to GDP ratio began an almost unstoppable climb, going from 34% in 74 of GDP, that is the national debt, to over 120% by the mid-90s. West Germany, again, managed to sort of had a low of minus 20% in the early 70s, and even they were up to over 40% of GDP by 1989, and France began to climb from a low of 21% in 1980. The EU response in the Maastricht Treaty in the 90s, the debt surge of the 1980s was a primary concern during the creation of the euro. The 1992 Maastricht Treaty was a direct response to this problem. New fiscal rules were created, and the treaty established the famous convergence criteria that countries had to meet to join the single currency. The two most important were a 3% limit on annual government deficits and a 60% limit on total government debt to GDP. The logic behind that was that they were designed to force countries, especially like really indebted ones, like Italy and Belgium, to get their finances in order. The fear was that fiscally irresponsible countries would join the euro, rack up loads of debt, and then need to be bailed out again, so destabilising the entire monetary union. So these rules were there to kind of anchor the fiscal policy in Europe. there was a new age of high debt, which was started in the financial crash of 2008 and still exists today. And that's kind of where we are. So despite the Maastricht rules, European debt levels have been pushed to new highs by two major global shocks. You got the 2008 subprime mortgage financial crisis. This crisis triggered the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. There were loads of bank bailouts. Governments like Ireland had to take on massive debts to bail out their failing banks. Loads of recessions, tax revenues collapsed while social spending on unemployment benefits soared. And countries like Greece peaking at over 180% of debt versus GDP, Italy pushing over 130, Portugal and Spain saw their debt levels explode, requiring international bailouts. In 2020, there was COVID as well, which really didn't help. This was the second massive shock. Governments are forced to borrow unprecedented sums to fund lockdowns, support furloughed workers and finance healthcare responses. The UK spent about 400 billion on that. France's debt, for example, rose from 98% of GDP in 2019 to almost 20% more, over 115% by the end of 2021. Again, Italy's debt went from 134 up to 155, and Germany and the UK also saw the debt ratios spike significantly. The major European economies' debt to GDP ratios far in excess of 60% Maastricht limit, a legacy of these back-to-back crises. So the Treaty of Versailles is like the very beginning of all this shit, and it's the sort of bedrock of the entire clusterfuck. And this, sort of German post-war, slightly unpalatable, not very politically correct conspiracy theory, but it's kind of bounded around by people, and make of it what you will, really. It says, in the narrative you're exploring, the Treaty of Versailles is not just related, it is the catalyst. It's the original sin of the 20th century that creates the historical and financial problems that every subsequent treaty, Rome, Lisbon and institution, the Bank of International Settlements, European Central Bank, is in one way or another a response to. So here's how it fits into the theories that you've asked about. So the factual connection between the Treaty of Versailles and the Bank of International Settlements. This is the most direct and historical factual link. So the Treaty of Versailles formally ended World War One, and then most famously imposed massive crippling war reparation payments on Germany. This created a global financial crisis. By the late 1920s, it was clear the German Weimar economy was collapsing under the strain and would basically default. The Bank of International Settlements was founded in 1930, and its only primary explicit and official purpose was to manage and settle the German reparation payments stipulated by the Treaty of Versailles as revised by the Young Plan. I don't know what that is, Google it. In the economic debt slavery narrative, this is the originals, or the origin story. The Bank of International Settlements was the first supranational financial institution created by governments to manage a massive, unpayable sovereign debt. The Fourth Reich theory, two answers to the German question. So this theory argues that the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Rome are two different answers to the same problem. So the German question, i.e. how to handle powerful Germany in the centre of Europe, answer one, you've got the Treaty of Versailles, that was in 1919, and that kind of imposed punishment, humiliation and containment, crippling debt, reparations, military restrictions, territorial losses, and the war guilt clause. What happened is that it failed catastrophically. It's widely blamed for the economic chaos that led to the rise of the Nazis, who capitalised on that, and ultimately World War II. So the other answer is that the Treaty of Rome, 1957, integrated and in partnership and enmeshment, created a common market that would make the French and German economies, especially their coal and steel industries, so interdependent that war would be materially impossible. What actually happened in this theory, people postulate, is that proponents of the Fourth Reich theory argue that this was actually a deception. They said instead of containing Germany, Treaty of Rome and its successor, the Lisbon Treaty, provided the very vehicle for Germany and finally and peacefully achieve what it failed to do through war, which was try and take over the world with economic and political dominance and a superstate called Europe. In this view, Versailles was the failed military attempt to control Germany, and the EU is the successful economic and political structure that allows Germany to control Europe. So the economic debt slavery theory, the perfected model, this theory contrasts the crude model of Versailles with the sophisticated model of the EU. The Versailles model, old system, in essence, like is an open political act. So the victorious nations, France, UK, militarily forced a defeated nation, Germany, to sign a treaty. And that treaty openly demanded reparations. They had to pay all the countries that they'd fucked back. The problem is that it was unstable. It was politically unpopular, caused hyperinflation, and led directly to another war because it was too crude. So the European Union, European Central Bank model, the new system, in theory, it works as a subtle bureaucratic process. Nations voluntarily join a monetary union, the euro, giving up their monetary sovereignty, and they're encouraged to run up deficits, profligation of fiat currency. And when a crisis hits, like in 2008, they can no longer print their own money to pay their own debts, which in turn means they have to get bailed out by the supranational banks back again to the ECB and the IMF, which are coordinated again by the same bank that was started in 1930, the Bank of International Settlements. So in exchange for the bailout, these unaccountable banks demand austerity, effectively seizing control of the nation's budget. As you see in countries like Greece, in this narrative, the debt slavery of modern Greece, simply a more stable, bureaucratic and perfected version of the reparations imposed on Germany at Versailles. The goal is the same: control of a nation's sovereignty through debt, but the mechanism is now financial and legal by the Lisbon Treaty rather than military. This is a bit of a kind of cynical question, but I asked how Gemini would broadly summarise and define all of the above mentioned in this thread within the context of a binary commentary regarding the success or failure of emancipation or freedom succeeding from the Second and First World Wars. Would it be proportionate to assert that sovereignty has been eroded, debt slavery has been created, and that in fact there was no success or real win in the First or Second World War? Would it be accurate to assert that the Allied forces, now impoverished by crippling levels of national debt, are ultimately at the behest of the same forces they were renowned to have achieved victory over following the end of both world wars? It's the King's birthday today, and it's also a lot of people of sort of commemorating remembrance at the moment. And I don't mean to kind of be cynical or sort of like demeaning or in any way denigrate the kind of sanctity of those who gave everything to promote freedom. But, I think if we're not critical about these kind of things and we don't scrutinise and question things like sovereign domestic infrastructures, which people gave their lives to defend, then I think we're at a disservice to them. So with that caveat, this is an advanced and highly complex synthesis, and it says you've connected all the events in this thread into a specific narrative. To answer your question directly, no, it would not be proportionate or accurate to assert that there was no real win, especially in the Second World War. The assertion represents one side of a binary commentary, a specific and highly critical interpretation of history. The view argues that the political and military victory over fascism was undermined by less viable, long-term financial and bureaucratic failure, but the mainstream historical consensus presents a profoundly different success narrative. So here's a breakdown of the two opposing commentaries that your binary question creates. So the failure of freedom, commentary, your proposed thesis. This is the narrative that you've laid out. It defines freedom as absolute national monetary sovereignty. In this view, the entire 20th century was a failure, you would argue. So, this commentary says that World War II was an unresolved disaster, that through the Treaty of Versailles created a system of unpayable debt. This debt and the reparations led to the creation of the first supranational financial body, the BIS, in 1930 to manage that crisis. The loss was then, continued in this narrative or conspiracy theory, which said that World War II, while militarily defeated by the Allied forces as the Third Reich, was a financial trap. It left the victorious Allies, like the UK, financially broken, in massive debt and dependent on the very central banking and industrial forces they were supposedly fighting. So the erosion, the Treaty of Rome, is then seen as the kind of new method for control. Instead of military conquest, it used economic integration to begin dissolving national sovereignty. The Lisbon Treaty is the final stage of this. So locking nations into a political structure that their consent, as critics argued. The slavery, the final element is fiat currency and the European Central Bank. So nations, having given up their political sovereignty via Lisbon Treaty and monetary sovereignty by joining the euro, can now be controlled through debt by an unelected central bank, which itself coordinates with this BIS. The Greek debt crisis is seen as a perfect, exemplary, demonstrable provision to show this to be true, and is debt slavery in action. In this commentary, the same forces interpreted as unelected globalist financial technocratic elite, personified by the Bank of International Settlements, simply changed tactics. They failed with military force in the First and Second World War, but succeeded by creating a bureaucratic Fourth Reich, the EU, which was built on debt. So the success, freedom of commentary and the mainstream view. This commentary defines freedom as the defeat of tyranny, the absence of war, and the growth of individual rights, democracy and prosperity. So the narrative, this view, contrastingly, holds that the Treaty of Versailles was flawed but understandable attempt to create national self-determination after the collapse of empires. Its failure led to the catastrophe of World War II. The real win was the Allied victory in World War II and is seen as the single greatest success for freedom in modern history. So well done them. It was an incomprehensible moral, political, and military victory that defeated a genocidal, totalitarian and militaristic ideology. To assert there was no real win is viewed as an ignoring the liberation of things like concentration camps and the restoration of democracy to Europe. I mean, the solution in this view is that the Treaty of Rome and the EU are the solution, not the problem. They were created by the Allies with US support via the Marshall Plan, Google that, to solve the very issues that caused the war. So by binding France and Germany's economies, the EU is designed to make a Third Reich or another European war impossible. So the pooled sovereignty, the Lisbon Treaty and the EU are not seen as an erosion of sovereignty, but as a pooling of it. So nations voluntarily agree to share power to gain greater collective strength and, most importantly, to lock in peace and create a single market to rival the US and China. The prosperity post-war debt was not slavery, but the investment that financed the 30 years of glorious growth, as they called it, the reconstruction of Europe and the creation of modern welfare state, healthcare, pensions, education. This easy credit period did fall down in 2008, but it, is seen on the other side of the coin. It's kind of giving a cynic or rational kind of conspiracy theory versus public popular opinion, normal form of public freedom and a vehicle for emancipation. But evaluating in conclusion my assertions or the assertions of conspiracy theorists on the internet, this is why specific assertions aren't considered proportionate by mainstream historians. So to say that there was no real success at the end of the Second World War is a core flaw. So it incorrectly equates financial cost with political and moral outcomes. So the Allies won the existential war for freedom, human rights and democracy. The fact that this victory came at a crippling financial cost doesn't negate the victory itself. So sovereignty has been eroded. This is a valid political interpretation, the core of the Eurosceptic argument, but it's not a settled fact. The success narrative would say sovereignty has been transformed or pooled to achieve a greater good, which was the end of the war in Western Europe, which can only be a good thing. So to say that they're at the behest of the same forces, this is a central assertion of a specific conspiracy theory. The mainstream view is the exact opposite. So the post-war order, the UN, NATO, IMF, World Bank and the EU project was a system built by the Allies, primarily the US and the UK, to contain and prevent the resurgence of the forces of nationalism, fascism and autarky that they had just defeated. That's the end of my video. It's 32 minutes long. If you found it mind-numbingly boring, then don't leave a like. If you hate me, do follow, because there's loads more shit videos to come. Thanks. Cheers. All the best.